Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight with From Genes to Crime Scenes with Josiah Schmidt. I'm Brent Trout from the St. Louis County Library History and Genealogy Department, and we are overjoyed to have this program tonight. This is a very popular topic in the field, and we're looking for some answers and some instruction, and we have the perfect person to do that, and that is Josiah Schmidt. He is a PhD candidate at Washington University in St. Louis, a licensed private investigator, and a professional genealogist. He has performed genetic genealogy consultations for multiple law enforcement agencies using DNA to help identify human remains. He has also assisted numerous adoptees and people of unknown parentage or uncertain parentage with identifying their biological families. And so, without further ado, we're going to hand it over to Josiah and take it away.
Hey, thanks, Brent. Hope everybody can hear and see me okay. So yeah, just a disclaimer before I begin tonight's presentation. So some of the topics that we're going to be touching on may be triggering for people who have possibly been the victims of sexual assault or violent crimes. So we will be talking about some of those topics. Just be forewarned. Let me share my screen with you all and then we can begin. All right. Hopefully everybody can see this okay. So first of all, many of you might be familiar with the case of the Golden State Killer. So this individual started a crime spree in the mid-1970s. I believe 1974 is the earliest crime that they have confirmed that this particular individual committed. He started with a string of burglaries, breaking into homes, stealing valuables. He then escalated into sexually assaulting women. And he started by targeting women who were at home, alone, or only with children. And eventually, after a number of years of doing this without being caught, he escalated once again to breaking into homes where couples were at home. And this kind of became his criminal specialty, terrorizing couples. So he would commit rape against the woman, and then he would usually murder both the man and the woman of the house at the end of his crime. This continued for over a decade. So he committed his crime spree from 1974 through 1986. For a time, it was believed that these were three different killers, just because he was so prolific and he was operating in different geographic locations. In 2001, however, they started to use DNA evidence that had been recovered from these crime scenes. And they were able to confirm in the early 2000s, based on direct matching of DNA, that the perpetrator of these crime sprees in these three different geographic locations within California were one and the same criminal. Now, at the time, they have DNA data regarding this criminal, but they can only do one-to-one matching. So unless this guy had been caught recently enough that his DNA would have been sampled by law enforcement and put into some kind of database, the DNA was not going to be very helpful in determining who this criminal was. And so you can see here, these are some of the sketches that law enforcement sketch artists put together based upon the recollection of some of the witnesses and the victims. You can see there's a pretty wide variety in terms of this guy's appearance here. With some very vague general similarities, really not one of these looks a whole lot like the other. And so this is kind of problematic This is a guy who apparently has some level of expertise and skill in evading capture and leaving behind insufficient evidence for him to be found and apprehended in an era when DNA evidence is not quite as useful as it is today in 2023. Now, 2001, of course, they're able to use DNA to link these three different crime sprees that happened in California and determine that they were all committed by the same guy. But it wouldn't be until the 2010s when new techniques with regard to using DNA evidence are able to determine who this criminal is. So the Golden State Killer, using these new DNA analysis techniques, was found to be none other than this gentleman, Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. He was actually a police officer at one point in the 1970s, where he would have gained some familiarity and knowledge with how criminals leave evidence behind, how criminals get caught, and he apparently used some of that knowledge to his own benefit as a serial criminal himself to evade capture, not just for the decade that he was committing these crimes, but for 30 years after he stopped his crime spree. And it's believed that the only reason this guy stopped, in addition to maybe kind of aging somewhat, not being as physically fit and able to do these things as he once was. But in 1981, his second to last crime, the victims fought back fiercely. Okay, and this scared Mr. DeAngelo to the point where for 5 years after 1981, he was too afraid to commit another crime. In 1986, he happened upon a young 16-year-old girl, defenseless by herself, and decided to commit one more crime. But after that, as far as anybody can tell, he was finished with committing crimes, in large part due to those victims who had fought back against him so fiercely in 1981. Now, for these 30 years, he must have thought that he had totally gotten away with all of this, and that he was never going to be held to account for his crimes. In 2016, investigators working on the Golden State Killer case utilized a new type of DNA analysis called genetic genealogy. What they did was they plugged a DNA sample kit from DNA that he had left behind during his crimes. They plugged that kit into a popular genealogy database website, and they were able to determine, based on who showed up as a relative of him, and then triangulating his position within multiple family trees, what his identity was, who he was. So, what is genetic genealogy? So, genetic genealogy, in its broadest sense, is basically the use of DNA to ascertain biological relationships between different people. So this is a concept that, at least in theory, was thought of as far back as the 1800s with Charles Darwin and his son, who had discussed the possibility of someday being able to use genetic data to determine relatedness. And so Charles Darwin's son had the idea that they could determine the amount of shared DNA in a community due to families intermarrying with one another. You'll recall that Charles Darwin himself married his cousin, and so Darwin's son was interested in this. Is there a way to quantify somehow, based on genetic data, the amount of relatedness that two people share. The phrase genetic genealogy was first coined in a newspaper article in 1989, and it was coined in reference to the work that scientists were doing to locate what they call DNA Eve. So by looking at the DNA of humans across the world, there were certain similarities that indicated to scientists that we all must descend from common ancestors or a common ancestor at some point. And so genetic genealogy was the phrase that was used to build upon the traditional field of genealogy, discovering relatedness, but using genetic data to do so. So genetic genealogy is in contrast to, or perhaps better said, in complement to so-called traditional genealogy, which uses documentary data, so paper records, sometimes digital records, and oral history to ascertain family relationships. Some of us in the field are not terribly keen on the phrase traditional genealogy. We're searching for better terminology just because we don't want traditional documentary genealogical research to seem in any way out of date or irrelevant. So the word traditional kind of comes with some baggage, but doing traditional genealogy work with paper records is incredibly important, both on its own and as a major component of genetic genealogy. So who are genetic genealogists? What kind of backgrounds are they coming from? There's these people who are now able to do this DNA analysis. It doesn't take a rocket scientist, but where are they coming from? So there are basically three major groups where genetic genealogy as a field is getting most of its practitioners. There's currently no bachelor's degree in genetic genealogy. Hopefully someday there will be. So anybody who gets into this field necessarily has to come into it from a different field. A lot of genetic genealogists, of course, come from traditional genealogists and historians. So the kind of people who are doing historical and family history research with those paper records, digital records, oral histories, etc. Some of the genetic genealogists today are coming into this field from law enforcement and from investigative occupations. So both private investigators and government or corporate or public investigators. So people who have those investigative skills, but perhaps maybe weren't experts in genetic analysis, maybe weren't experts in historical research, yet they have that core of investigative skill and they're able to learn enough of the DNA analysis, they're able to learn enough of the historical research skills and synthesize that to become genetic genealogists. And then thirdly, forensic scientists. So there are a lot of genetic genealogists today who start out in fields like biology and forensic science, and of course, genetics. But if they're able to add on those skills of doing family history and historical research, again, they can synthesize that kind of STEM side and the humanities side together. And that's what genetic genealogy takes, is this synthesis of basically genetic science, family history, regular historical research, investigative skills, and a little bit of law. So doing genetic genealogy requires you to know a little something about the different types of DNA that we have as humans in our body. So there are basically two main parts of the human body where you find an individual's DNA. So inside of every cell in our body, you have a nucleus. And inside of that nucleus, you have basically the what people talk about when they say the human genome. So that particular kind of DNA is inside the nucleus of every cell. And that type of DNA is referred to as autosomal DNA. So the autosomes are the 22 pairs of chromosomes. So you might have seen images or diagrams of a chromosome before. They're basically these X-shaped clumps of genetic material. Now, the 23rd pair of chromosomes are the sex chromosomes. And so that's what determines a human's biological sex. So a lot of you are probably also familiar with the website and service called 23andMe. So 23andMe.com, that comes from this concept of there being 23 pairs of chromosomes inside of every nucleus of every cell in every human's body. There are some differences, people with certain genetic disorders, Down syndrome and such, where not every human has exactly 23 pairs of chromosomes, but for the most part, everyone has 23 pairs of chromosomes. So the sex chromosomes, the 23rd pair, comprise of the Y chromosome, which is passed down from fathers to sons. The Y chromosome is really great for doing surname research because, at least in the West, surnames are also passed down from fathers to sons. And so surnames correlate very strongly with Y chromosome genetic data. X chromosomes, which are inherited from both the father and mother, except in the case when it is a son, in which case a son will inherit an X chromosome only from his mother, and he will inherit from his father a Y chromosome. So daughters, however, will inherit an X chromosome from the mother and an X chromosome from the father. So biological males will have what's called XY sex chromosomes, and biological females will have what's called XX chromosomes. So that's the bulk of the genetic data in a human body. So nuclear DNA has about 3 billion base pairs worth of genetic data. However, it's not the only genome in the human body. There is one other genome that humans have, and that is the mitochondrial DNA. So inside of every cell, you've got a nucleus. You've also got mitochondria. So you think back to your high school science classes, mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell, but they also contain these clumps of DNA, mitochondrial DNA. And just as Y DNA on the Y chromosome is super useful for doing male genealogy, biological male genealogy, because Y chromosome genetic data is only passed down from fathers to sons. Mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from mothers. And both males and females inherit mitochondrial DNA. Now, mitochondrial DNA is great for doing research on purely maternal ancestry. So your mother and her mother and her mother and her mother in a straight line back solely of mothers. But because there is not as much data in mitochondrial DNA, it doesn't quite have the same resolution that autosomal DNA has, so the DNA that you find in the nucleus. So I mentioned before that nuclear DNA has about 3 billion base pairs worth of data. Mitochondrial DNA only has about 16,000 base pairs of data. And so this is a diagram of X DNA inheritance. So you'll recall Y chromosomes are passed down from fathers to sons. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down from mothers to children. X chromosomes, in the case of daughters, are inherited 1X from each parent. In the case of sons, are inherited from the mother. And X chromosomes are also a way that you can do genetic genealogy in certain circumstances. And it's kind of a cutting edge field or subfield, I should say, within the field of genetic genealogy. So you'll see here on this chart, the circle in the middle, the pink circle there. So you can think of that as a daughter. The two segments immediately surrounding the circle, those represent the father of the daughter and the mother of the daughter. So both the father and the mother are contributing X DNA to the daughter. You'll notice that on the father's side of this fan chart, so the left side of the fan chart, a huge chunk of it is blank, is white. There's no X DNA being passed down because the father only gets X DNA from his mother. His mother passes him down one X chromosome, but he did not get an X chromosome from his father. I could get into the weeds a little bit here about the fact that sometimes the mother and father's X chromosomes do kind of pass over one another on the tips, and sometimes there's a little bit of exchange, and a teensy bit of the father's X DNA will basically get stuck onto the mother's X chromosome that she's passing down to the offspring. However, for the most part, this is what X DNA inheritance looks like. And so let's say that you take a DNA test and you upload your data, and you get a DNA match, and it says that in addition to maybe sharing some autosomal DNA with this match, you also share some X DNA with this match. Now, if you have no idea who this match is, you've never heard their name before, you don't know how they're related to you, but if they share a little bit of X DNA with you, you know, for instance, if you are a biological female, that you are not going to be related to this person through your father's father, because your father did not inherit any X DNA from his father. So only the parts of this fan chart that are colored in either blue and pink are realistic routes for you to be related to somebody who has X DNA shared in common with you. So if you ever get an X DNA match on a genealogy website, using a chart like this can help you narrow down which branches of the family you and this match could possibly be related through. So that's just an aside. It's a really exciting new field of genetic genealogy that I wanted you to be aware of, but it's a little bit tangential. So the main way that genetic genealogy is done is through two main types of DNA data. And the first type is called an STR, which stands for short tandem repeat. And this type of DNA is found on what's called the non-coding portions of your DNA. And so what that means is there are certain segments of your DNA that are coding portions, and that these portions of DNA produce the amino acids that help to create proteins, basically. So they are the more functional, the coding portions of your DNA are the more functional parts of your DNA. However, 99% of your DNA is non-coding. So, when you watch those videos showing how coding DNA generates these amino acids that result in these bodily functions happening, that's only a tiny portion of your DNA. So the non-coding portion of the DNA helps to regulate the rest of the DNA, and it helps to determine whether the coding portions of the DNA are activated or not. In addition to this, the non-coding portions of the DNA have these little segments of repetition, and they are very useful for doing genetic genealogy, because the number of times that these segments repeat is passed down to one's offspring generally, unless there is a rare mutation. So you can see here the G, A, T, and C. These are, of course, the bases that form the structure of DNA. So if somebody has a short tandem repeat on the non-coding portion of their DNA that goes GTG, 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 that has a repeat value of 3. And when that person reproduces, more than likely, their offspring will also have a repeat value of 3 in that exact same location. Now, if it goes GTG, 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 then that's a repeat value of 5. And when that person goes to reproduce, their offspring will also very likely have a repeat value of 5 there. And so this is a way for genetic genealogists to trace relatedness. If you've got 2 different people and they take a DNA test that looks at these STRs, and one person has repeat values of 3, 7, 8, 9. The other person in those same locations has repeat values of 10, 5, 4, 12, 11, completely different. The overwhelming odds are that these 2 people are not related, not closely related in the genealogical sense. However, if all the values match, that can be a strong indicator that these 2 individuals are in fact related. Another type of DNA data that genetic genealogists use is called a SNP, or single nucleotide polymorphism. So that is a mouthful. A nucleotide is basically a base connected to a sugar molecule, is basically a component that contains a base. But you can think of it as just the G, the A, the T, and the C for the purposes of doing SNP analysis. And of course, polymorphism means that something has changed. So here are, for instance, 3 different series of bases or nucleotides, GATTACA. You've got in the red column here, you can see most humans have a G in this location. But if when somebody was conceived, there was a minor copying error, they might have ended up with a C instead of a G in this location. And then when that person goes to procreate and they generate offspring, they're going to pass down that same anomaly to their kids, and those kids to their offspring, and so on and so forth. And you've created basically what's called a haplogroup. So 99.9% of humans' genome is the same from one human to another. The 0.1% where we differ accounts for all the differences between you and I, or between me and Brent. All of the differences between us are basically accounted for by that 0.1%. So when you're looking at a genome and you see, humans have a G in this location, but this one human has a C, that's something noteworthy. Again, the next red column over here, if most humans have an A in this location, but one human had a copying error in that spot when they were conceived, and they ended up with a T, they're going to pass that down to their offspring, who will pass it on to their offspring. And so that is a way to identify family groups. So now, talking a little bit about how all of this intersects with the criminal justice system and with crime scenes. So there is a principle called Locard's principle of exchange, which basically states that a criminal at a crime scene always takes something and always leaves something behind. And one of the things, of course, that almost all criminals leave behind at crime scenes is their DNA in some form or another, unless they're very careful. So sources of DNA in criminal investigations might include hair, might include nail clippings, might include organs, and that includes skin, might include blood, and investigators might be able to get DNA from direct swabs of orifices. So that could be oral orifice, anal, vaginal, and so forth. As for hair, in previous years, it was thought that you had to have hair with the root still attached in order to get usable DNA for investigations. There have been recent advances within the past few years that have now enabled investigators to be able to get usable genetic data even from rootless hairs. So, when cells are turning into nails or hair through the process of keratinization, usually the cell will kind of get smushed. The interior of the cell will get filled with this tough protein. The nucleus of the cell that contains all that valuable autosomal DNA will just get smushed and obliterated. But not every cell loses all of its autosomal or nuclear DNA in that process. And so these new techniques of extracting usable DNA from even rootless hairs are now coming into play. Granted, it's still a very new set of techniques, very expensive, certainly does not have a 100% success rate, but that is a new possibility that is coming into play. So now, what kinds of uses of forensic genetic genealogy can there be in the justice system? There are a lot of different types of uses. However, the main ones include identifying unidentified human remains, or so-called John Does and Jane Does, narrowing in on homicide suspects or sexual assault suspects. I mentioned those two crimes specifically because there are only a couple of DNA databases that allow law enforcement to work with their data. And both of those databases stipulate that law enforcement are only allowed to use their databases if they are investigating a homicide or a sexual assault. I believe Maryland passed a law a couple of years ago, as they're one of the pioneers in starting to regulate the field of forensic genetic genealogy. And I believe the Maryland law says something to the effect of, I don't have the wording in front of me, something to the effect of genetic genealogy also being perhaps an appropriate technique in cases where there is kind of an imminent threat to public safety. So that might be like a threat of terrorism. If somebody is planning to release a nuclear or biological weapon or something, and you need to stop them, but they haven't committed a homicide or a sexual assault yet, I think the Maryland law, perhaps that will also be added into the language of the terms of service of some of these databases that are open to law enforcement. A third use of genetic genealogy in the justice system is uncovering fraud in fertility clinics. So there was, of course, a very famous case a couple of years ago about a fertility doctor who had been substituting his own sperm in vitro pregnancies. And basically he had created his own enormous family of offspring without the consent of the women who had been going to this fertility clinic. So there's an interesting documentary about that. I think it's called Baby God, which you can check out. I've also been involved in one such case with a client who came to me expressing concern that they had used a fertility clinic and their child had come out looking nothing like them. And so they were able to do DNA testing and confirm that the child had not come from the intended father's sperm, had not come from the intended father's genetic material, and that an employee at the fertility clinic had in fact substituted his own sperm in that conception. So this is not a one-off situation. Unfortunately, every so often this does happen. And so this is one of the uses that forensic genetic genealogy can help to uncover and can help families find justice. And then, of course, confirming parentage for child support or inheritance cases. So genetic analysis is becoming increasingly used around the world to help resolve some of these questions of whether a child is actually the biological offspring of a purported parent for a child support or a probate case. So I mentioned some of the DNA databases already, but I just want everyone to be clear on the different types of DNA databases out there and the different policies and ways that they can be used. So the top three are perhaps the ones that we are most familiar with as genealogists, but just as regular consumers, a lot of people who are not active family history researchers have taken ancestry DNA tests, 23andMe DNA tests, and MyHeritage DNA tests. Now, these first three are only for traditional genealogists, for non-law enforcement consumers. The terms of service of these first three databases explicitly forbid law enforcement from using their databases in criminal investigations. I believe all three of their terms of service say that they will not voluntarily divulge any of their data to law enforcement, with the implication being that, were there a valid court order, subpoena, search warrant, that then they would divulge that data. I think I saw a news story not too long ago, maybe in 2019 or 2020, where a court in Pennsylvania actually lodged a search warrant against Ancestry DNA, requesting that they allow law enforcement to access their data. But I believe Ancestry's lawyers pushed back against that, and in the end, Ancestry did not have to comply. I mean, that's a really excellent test of how strong these policies are and how well they can be enforced. Now, family tree DNA at ftdna.com or GEDmatch, these two databases do permit law enforcement and investigators to use their databases to conduct forensic genetic genealogy in a criminal investigation setting. Now, users in these two databases, as of right now in 2023, do need to opt in to what's referred to as law enforcement sharing. So if you just upload your DNA data to Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch, you're not automatically going to be opted in to the kind of subcategory of data that law enforcement and investigators can look at to solve crimes. You do have to click the button to opt yourself in. And even if you're opted in, you can also go into your kind of user privacy settings and opt yourself back out at a later date. Of course, then there is also a database known as CODIS. So CODIS is an acronym that stands for Combined DNA Index System, and it is a database that is maintained by the FBI. And a lot of the data in CODIS comes from felons and criminals who, during the booking process, have a DNA sample taken from them so that they can be in this database. So you'll remember back a few slides to when we talked about STRs, short tandem repeats. So CODIS for a long time only looked at 13 STRs. You can do STR tests through Family Tree DNA, for instance, that go up to like 700 STRs. So just 13 STRs is not a whole lot of data. I believe a couple of years ago, CODIS upped that to 20 STRs. I think they added on another 7. But still, that's only 20 STRs. So CODIS is much better for direct matching. So if you get a DNA sample from a crime scene that you think may have been left behind by the perpetrator of that crime, you can try to upload it. And when I say you, of course, I mean authorized government investigators. I, as a private investigator, have no access to CODIS, but an authorized government investigator can upload that DNA sample into CODIS. If there is a direct hit, if all of the STRs match perfectly, then you can feel pretty good that you might have identified the right individual. But it's not necessarily going to tell you, okay, you uploaded this DNA profile into CODIS. This other guy who's also in CODIS is a second cousin twice removed. It's not going to tell you that. So CODIS is good for direct matching, but if you want to do more advanced genetic genealogy, then you need to use Family Tree DNA or GEDmatch if you are law enforcement. Now, so what's the actual process of doing genetic genealogy? So genetic genealogy really depends on a critical mass of users. When Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch were first launched, and they had 0 users in their database, they were completely useless as far as genetic genealogy is concerned. You upload your DNA data into a database with no people in it. You're not going to get any matches. It's not going to give you any usable information. So you need a lot of people in your database, and you need them to come from different families, different geographic areas, different ethnicities, so that when you upload a sample of someone whose identity is unknown, um, you're able to find people who are sufficiently related to the owner of that sample that you can ascertain how these two people fit together in, excuse me, in a family tree. So when DNA test kits are uploaded into databases like FTDNA and GEDmatch, the closeness of each match is quantified in terms of what's called centimorgans. Centimorgans are often abbreviated as CM. So centimorgans are a kind of measurement of distance across a chromosome. If you're speaking very precisely, one chromosome is equal to a 1% chance that two markers on a chromosome will become separated from one another during recombination, during meiosis. However, that's a little hard to wrap your mind around. More roughly speaking, you could say that one centimorgan equals approximately 1 million base pairs. And that's the rough definition of a centimorgan. So how does that all shake out? Here's a really helpful chart from a genetic genealogist by the name of Blaine Bettinger. And for anybody who gets into the field of genetic genealogy, you're going to come across his name. He's very prominent in the field, and he creates this very helpful chart, which he updates at regular intervals. So I'm using version 4.0. I actually have this chart printed out and stuck up on my wall here because I refer to it so frequently. But you can see here in this very beautifully color-coded chart that parents and children, for instance, share roughly 2,300 to 3,700 centimorgans of DNA. Now, when you upload your DNA test kit to these databases, or if you're not working on a criminal investigation and you just take an ancestry test or 23andMe test, you're also going to get this centimorgan data. So if you share roughly somewhere between 2,400 and 3,700 centimorgans of DNA with somebody, that person is probably going to be either your parent or your child. So of course, every so often, working with an adoptee client, they'll come to me and they'll say, I uploaded my DNA or I took a DNA test on one of these major websites, looking for my biological family, perhaps looking for my parent, my father or my mother, and boom, at the top of my match list, there is this person, and it says that they share 3,400 centimorgans with me. And then when I reach out to the person says, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly be your parent. I wasn't in the right place at the right time," or I only dated your mom. It was nothing serious. We never slept together. So DNA doesn't lie. If you upload your DNA data or take a DNA test, and at the top of your list, there's somebody who's 20 to 40 years older than you, and they're 3,400 centimorgans, give or take 900. There's a really good chance that that's your parent. And when I say really good chance, like 99% plus chance that that's your parent. Siblings are roughly 1,600 to 3,500 centimorgans. First cousins, 400 to 1,400 centimorgans roughly. Second cousins, 40 to 600 centimorgans. When you get to third cousins, technically it's possible that, we each inherit DNA kind of randomly from each of our parents. So it's theoretically possible for a third cousin or a pair of third cousins to share no DNA in common. You might have 0 centimorgans in common with a third cousin. a little more likely that you'll have somewhere around 70 to 80 centimorgans. Also, conceivably possible that you could share as much as like 230 centimorgans with a third cousin. And then, as you can see, these mathematics change a little bit if you're looking at half relationships, like a half sibling, half cousin, half aunt or uncle. They also change with double relationships. So a double relationship would be, um, a brother. How do I say this? A set of two brothers marries from one family, marries a set of two sisters from another family. So, John Johnson and George Johnson. John Johnson marries Elizabeth Smith. George Johnson, John's brother, marries Elizabeth's sister, Kate Smith. Now, when both of those couples have offspring, um, those couples are going to be, those offspring, rather, are going to be first cousins of one another through their paternal side, and also first cousins through their maternal side. And so those are called double cousins. And that can double the amount of centimorgans that you share. So taking into account the possibility of half or double relationships gives you a little bit of wiggle room. So, if you share 2,000 centimorgans with somebody, um, don't immediately jump to a conclusion that they are this specific relation to you, because there's kind of a range of different relationships that could be indicated by 2,000 centimorgans, for instance. So I would highly recommend, if you're doing genetic genealogy, to get one of these charts. They're all over the place online. You can just type in, Blaine Bettinger shared CM project chart or something to that effect. It'll pop up in a Google image search or just a regular Google search. It's really important to have these numbers in front of you. After a while, you'll start to memorize some of these number ranges, but based on more data coming in over the years, some of these numbers and number ranges will be tweaked. And so it's good to keep current on what these number ranges are. So now I've told you guys some of what genetic genealogists do, and what genetic genealogists assisting law enforcement or genetic genealogists who are private investigators and who are assisting clients who may want to investigate their own situation that may have been a criminal situation, what they do. But here is what genetic genealogists working in the criminal investigation field do not do. If we are working with law enforcement, we as the genetic genealogists do not handle the physical evidence. We are not the ones tasked with going out and doing the cheek swabs. We are definitely not the ones who, sit in the unmarked cars and wait for suspects to drop a cigarette or a soda can. We are not, generally speaking, the genetic genealogists are not the ones in the lab, doing the gel electrophoresis or anything. We are not nabbing petty criminals. So you'll recall a few slides previously, I mentioned that the two major DNA databases that allow for these types of investigations, they stipulate in their terms of service that the only types of investigations that can be done in their database are homicide investigations and sexual assault investigations. So genetic genealogists are not using DNA to nab litterers or shoplifters or basically any other crime. except for homicide and sexual assault. Even, to some extent, regular physical assaults, unless it's a truly violent assault, genetic genealogy will not be used. When we are assisting law enforcement, we of course do not use the major DNA databases. You sometimes see this talked about by people on the news who say, oh, these genetic genealogists are using your ancestry data, or they're going on to 23andMe to catch criminals. And that is not true. So the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, was identified in 2016 through GEDmatch, not through Ancestry or 23andMe. Granted, back in 2016, this was the first time this had ever been done, using genetic genealogy to identify a criminal suspect. And so it was kind of a Wild West back then. It's still, to a certain extent, a Wild West today. There are burgeoning movements to regulate and regularize the genetic genealogy field, but we're still figuring things out. So it was after the Golden State Killer case that a lot of these websites started to add these stipulations in their terms of service, that they and their data could not be used for these investigations. We as genetic genealogists also are very careful in our terminology about working on these cases. So genetic genealogists, or perhaps I should say good genetic genealogists, never say that we solve criminal cases, especially when we're working with law enforcement. What genetic genealogists do is to provide a high quality lead to law enforcement. And then law enforcement's job is to go and do the kind of on the ground gumshoe work to make a one-to-one direct match. So a genetic genealogist will, will be working with a lab that might extract DNA from a sample left behind at a crime scene and come up with a usable DNA kit that can be uploaded to like FTDNA or GEDmatch. When that kit is uploaded, we see this list of matches, matches who share certain amounts of DNA with the owner of the sample. Might be 2,000 centimorgans, which is wonderful when you see that number. It might be 1,000, might be 500, 50. Generally speaking, we like to see matches of at least 40 centimorgans or higher if we want to have a realistic hope of figuring out that high quality lead at this time. It is possible, though very difficult in many circumstances, to work on a case when the matches are below 40 centimorgans, but there are some that are above 20 centimorgans. So the 20 to 30 centimorgan range, somewhat possible, but very tough. If there are no matches in the 20 centimorgan range or higher, for all practical purpose, a case is unsolvable at this time. And again, like I said before, genetic genealogy requires a critical mass of other users who are doing this genealogy so that we have data to compare it to. Once we identify who these people are that match with the sample, we are able to see, okay, which of these matches are related to one another. We might be able to find out that match A, match C, match E are related to the owner of our sample, but they're also related to each other. So they are a family group. And then we might be able to find out that match B, match D, and match F are related to our sample, and they are also related to each other, but B, D, and F are not related to A, C, and E. So that's a separate family group. So once you're able to establish these family groups, your next task as a genetic genealogist is to build the family trees of these groups backward to find out what is the common ancestor of these members of this family group. And so eventually, if all goes well, you're able to build the family trees of each family group up and backward in time, and you find these patriarchs and matriarchs, these common ancestors. So this is an individual who would be a common ancestor of A, C, and E, and also a common ancestor of your owner of your sample. And so then that's great. So then you can start to establish, okay, I don't know who this individual is who left this sample, but I know that they somehow descend from John Smith, who lived in the 1800s. And then you do that for other family groups. You build back to a common ancestor. You figure out who the common ancestor of, for instance, B, D, and F are, because that would also be the common ancestor of the owner of your sample. And then again, you might not know who the individual who left behind that genetic sample is, but you know that they somehow, more than likely, descend from William Johnson, who lived in the 1800s. It's great if you can get that common ancestor that's a little more recent, who lived in the 20th century. That really helps to narrow it down. But once you've got different common ancestors that you've established and different family groups, the task is then for the genetic genealogist to trace all of the children of John Smith, all the grandchildren of John Smith, all the great-grandchildren, the great-great-grandchildren of John Smith, all the way down to the present. And you start doing the same thing for the other common ancestor, William Johnson. You trace all of William's children, all of his grandchildren, all of his great-grandchildren, and so on. And ideally, assuming there have been no, what we like to call non-paternity events, NPEs, things like infidelity or secret adoptions, assuming there have been none of those, ideally, you suddenly find somebody from the Smith family who marries or procreates with somebody from the Johnson family. And you don't always find that, but sometimes you might find that this fella from the Smith family was in the same, very localized area, the same small town or neighborhood as this gal from the Johnson family at the exact same time. Maybe you can even use address books, city directories, newspapers, what have you, to determine that they lived on the same block or the same street. And suddenly you've got a very good candidate for the perhaps parents or grandparents of the owner of your sample. So then you can focus on that part of the Smith and Johnson tree where those two trees overlap. Sometimes you're lucky enough to find multiple family groups with multiple common ancestors, perhaps 3 or 4, and then you can really triangulate, because where all 3 or 4 of these trees overlap and come together, that really helps you focus on who your suspect might be. And once you've got a smaller, more manageable family group to look at for your suspect, either the actual owner of the sample, or if you're helping an adoptee, the possible parent of the client. Once you've got that smaller group, you're able to look for people who are in the right place at the right time to produce your client, or to produce the DNA profile that you've got from your sample kit. And so you can then start to rule people out. This guy was too young to have committed the crime, or to have procreated with the adoptee's mother. This person wasn't even in the right part of the country, and so on and so forth. And then once you've narrowed it down to people who mathematically, based on the amounts of centimorgans shared, could be your right person, and you might have multiple of those, you can then start to do direct testing or direct comparisons to try to pinpoint with better accuracy who your suspect might be. And this is often, when genetic genealogists are working with law enforcement, the point at which law enforcement really takes over and does all the things that they have to do to make that direct match and to gather the evidence so that they can get a conviction that will hold up in court. And then the last thing that genetic genealogists do not do is we do not get rich. I know of no rich genetic genealogists in our field. Many of us do our work pro bono, so at no charge. The law enforcement with whom I have worked, that work I have done pro bono. There are volunteer groups like the DNA Doe Project that lend their services for free to law enforcement entities. And then there are other singular genetic genealogists like myself who are not affiliated with any sort of larger company or lab, who also offer their consultations at no charge to law enforcement. Many of the genetic genealogists who are actual employees of firms that do genetic genealogy, they are paid very modest nominal wages. So this is really a field where passion is key, and there's going to be no expectation of immense wealth. That would be great if, police departments around the country started to create positions that focused on using genetic genealogy to solve cold cases, or even to use on very urgent hot cases as one of the many prongs of investigative approach. It would be great if those positions were created and governments were willing to pay law enforcement officers to use forensic genetic genealogy to bring murderers and rapists to justice. We're not quite there yet, but perhaps at some point in the future that will be a thing. Again, there's probably not going to be any way for anyone to strike it rich as a genetic genealogist, even if they are in a paid role. So I'm going to close by just talking about kind of the state of the genetic genealogy profession. We are in a very new field, and we're in a field in a state in which there's a lot of flux. So there's a lot of things happening. The field is changing by the year, sometimes by the month. The biggest thing about the field of forensic genetic genealogy right now, and you might have noticed that I kind of switch back and forth between using the phrase forensic genetic genealogy and investigative genetic genealogy. They both really refer to the same thing. There is some debate in our field right now as to which phraseology is preferable. There's some sense that maybe forensic genetic genealogist sounds a little too laboratory-ish and gives the false impression that a lot of us are, forensic biologists, which a lot of us are, when that's not necessarily the case. whereas investigative genetic genealogy makes us sound like we're all kind of like law enforcement investigators or private detectives, which again, some of us are, but that's not necessarily the case. I tend to not get so hung up on this terminology debate. Perhaps it will be resolved in the coming years and we'll all just start using one phrase. But for now, if you hear about forensic or investigative genetic genealogy, so-called FGG or IGG, for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. So there is a lot of scrutiny on forensic genetic genealogy right now. So it's imperative that practitioners of forensic genetic genealogy or FGG use the utmost care, use the utmost precision, professionalism, have immense respect for privacy, and knowledge of and respect for the laws that are applicable to our field. We really have to be on our best behavior. We need to be professional and we need to be respectful. If we are not, we could, perhaps rightly so, face some major government oversight and government kind of meddling in the field that could make it more difficult for genetic genealogy to solve murder and rape cases. So it's really important that genetic genealogists be seen as professional, as rule-abiding, as respectful, respectful of privacy, careful, not pointing fingers at incorrect suspects, making sure that we give the highest quality information to our law enforcement partners and government agencies. In service of those goals of trying to create a respectable professional field, there are some big things happening. For instance, we have the first graduate certificate that is now being offered in the field of forensic genetic genealogy, and that is being offered by the University of New Haven. So it is not a master's degree. It is not a degree of any sort. It is a graduate certificate. University of New Haven, I believe, will accept applications from anyone with a bachelor's degree to be accepted into that certificate program. And so this is one of those programs that's going to start turning out professional, trained genetic genealogists who have a common language, who are on the same page, who are aware of the latest technology, who are cognizant of the laws that are affecting what we do. There is a new organization that is in the process of being put together, and that is the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board. So again, that's kind of a mouthful, but the acronym is IGAB or IGGAB. So you can plug IGGAB, IGAB into Google. You can find their website. They're in the process of consulting with some of the leaders in the field to come up with standards that everyone can agree upon, to eventually come up with an accrediting exam that practitioners of forensic genetic genealogy would be able to sit for, and if they pass, they would be able to become credentialed as an accredited forensic genetic genealogist. That's still probably another year or two, or perhaps more off. There are a lot of things to hammer out in regard to that. So I would not be surprised if that took a little bit longer. But IGAB is encouraging governments and government regulators to use their exam and their standards in any sort of certification requirements that state governments might come up with. And some states have already started this process. So I mentioned Maryland earlier is one of those states that has passed a law seeking to begin the process of regulating and standardizing the field of forensic genetic genealogy. There are states like Montana and Utah that are also starting to pass laws seeking to regulate this profession. Maryland has expressed in their recently passed law the intention that practitioners of FGG in Maryland and laboratories working on FGG in Maryland will have to be certified. Now, if you've been paying attention to that news at all, there have been some problems with that recently because the government failed to provide any funding to those regulators with which to implement that certification program. So that's kind of on hold in Maryland now, but it's coming. It's in the pipeline, and other states are going to begin following suit. And then lastly, there's a burgeoning conversation within the genealogical field, and specifically the genetic genealogical field, asking the question, do most state laws perhaps already require private investigator certification for forensic genetic genealogists, or maybe even for professional genealogists, based on the letter of the law? So I will say, I am a PhD candidate, not a JD student. I am not a law student. That is not my forte. But these conversations are beginning to be had in the genealogy field because many states have in their statutes a stipulation that says, first of all, people performing private investigations are legally required by this state to be certified as a licensed private investigator. I think there are only 5 states in the country that do not require private investigators to be licensed. Missouri is one of the states that requires licensure of private investigators. And a lot of these states that have these statutes have a second element, which says, okay, what is private investigation? What is a private investigator? A private investigator, a lot of these state statutes say, is anyone who in return for money or consideration performs any investigation into, and then there's this huge bullet list. And some of the items on the bullet list are things like, if you're performing an investigation for a client trying to determine someone's identity, if you're performing an investigation for a paying client trying to determine someone else's location, someone else's movements, someone else's occupation, you're trying to investigate someone else's character, someone else's personal history, all these different aspects of another person that you could be investigating for a client. A lot of states around the country, here in the United States, say if you're doing those kind of investigations for a client and you're getting paid, you have to have private investigator licensure. Now, there are very few people currently working as professional genealogists or even as forensic genetic genealogists who have private investigator licensure. But a lot of us are now starting to get on that wagon because just because this issue has never been litigated before, it's kind of a landmine that's just sitting there. Should professional genealogists, or at least should professional genetic genealogists, already be licensed as a private investigator? Should they be required to go and sit for this exam and pass this exam and get this license and maintain the license and stay in good conduct? Should they be doing this already based on the things that they're doing? That's kind of yet to be determined. But again, the trend within the field of professional genealogy, and especially the field of professional genetic genealogy, is moving towards more government oversight, more regulation, more standardization, because the stakes are very high in this field. You don't want to somehow produce bad evidence that gets a conviction overturned based on a technicality. Um, you don't want to accidentally impinge on somebody's privacy. You don't want to wrongfully accuse someone of a crime. There's so many reasons why you need some kind of scaffolding around this newly growing field of genetic genealogy to ensure that you know people aren't misusing this technique and resulting in governments cracking down on the technique and maybe wiping it out and making it so that this technique can no longer be used in apprehending murderers, rapists. So a lot of scrutiny on the field right now. The field is changing, but a lot of people are pouring into the field. So if you are somebody who has maybe already done genetic genealogy for yourself, for your own family members, perhaps you are what's known as a search angel, and you have been freely helping other people who may be adoptees or people of uncertain parentage find out who their biological family is. There are going to be a lot of avenues for you to get into that more professionally if you want. And so now I am happy to open this up for questions and to talk about any other topics that you guys might be curious about.
Yes, friends, let's toss your questions into the Q&A, and I will relay them over to our wonderful host. Now, Josiah, we had a couple throughout the presentation that were easily answerable, but I just want to thank you for giving us this wonderful presentation. And I want to let everyone know that I was today years old when I realized that the title of the movie from 1997, Gattaca, was actually about the DNA that they were making the movie about.
I'm glad you noticed that little Easter egg. Yeah.
All right. A couple more minutes, we'll wait for some questions. And if we don't have any questions, we will just end the presentation. The handout will be going out tomorrow morning when we thank you for your attendance. Some folks were able to email and get it right away. If you that answer is still in the Q&A, if you want it right away. You're getting a lot of people thanking you for learning so much. Jim Ross said this is one of the best presentations he's ever seen. Thank you much. We love
That's very
hosting quality
encouraging. And yeah,
presentations.
thank you guys for coming to learn more about this. And I hope it sparked an interest in some of you and that those of you who have maybe not tried it will start to get into the field. Those of you who already have dipped your feet into this will go in a little bit deeper. There are, I think, over 500,000 cold cases in the country at this time, and it's all hands on deck. Investigators need all the help they can get. So if this is something that you're interested in doing, even as kind of a side interest, I heard from Claire Glynn, Dr. Claire Glynn, who runs the Forensic Genetic Genealogy program at University of New Haven, that she has had incoming students in her FGG certification program as old as in their 70s. So it's never too late to learn some of these new skills and to make a difference. Some of the most important and significant players in this field right now are people who have like had an entire career and retired. People like Barbara Ray Venter, Colleen Fitzpatrick. Of course, there are people like the wonderful, lovely CeCe Moore who are making careers out of this and kind of paving the way for the rest of us to show us how it can be done. So yeah, so no matter what stage of career you are in, if you are retired, these are some great skills to learn.
Yeah, I have to say that's one of my favorite parts about something like this is that genealogy usually gets stereotyped being something like your grandparents do near the end of life. And it's not just finding out who the great great grandfather was, it's solving crimes, and so very much a turn of the narrative that I appreciate.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think one of the most interesting recent clients I had was a so-called traditional genealogy client who was just trying to figure out who her great 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 grandparents were. And we were able, actually, my client and I were able to solve a 300-year-old rape crime. We were able to figure out who in this small village, based on the DNA of my client and her close ancestors, and based on the DNA passed down to other people whose ancestors came from this village, who was the perpetrator of the sexual assault that resulted in my client's great-great-grandmother. So when you talk about solving crimes, this is not just 50-year-old cold cases. This can be 300-year-old cold cases. So even if you start at it from a standpoint of doing traditional genealogy, sometimes you still pick up these detective skills.
So we do have a question here. So the question is IGGAB the best place to start?
It's going to be. You can go on their website now. It's a little bit bare bones at the moment, but they have some good resources. And some of the resources include reading that you can do in academic journals. So journal articles that have been written about forensic genetic genealogy. You can also find guidelines from government agencies on forensic genetic genealogy. So they have Department of Justice guidelines. They have an overview from the Scientific Working Group on DNA Analysis Methods, an MOU from the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office, position paper from the American Society of Crime Lab Detectors. I've included in the handout, which I think Brent is helping to get out to those of you who would like it, some further reading that you can do on genetic genealogy. And so these are some books. You will notice they're like all 10 years old or more recent, because this field is so brand spanking new. You can find books I would recommend, like Understanding Forensic DNA by Suzanne Bell and John Butler, The Family Tree Guide to DNA Testing by Blaine Bettinger. You're going to see his name a lot if you get into this field. Genetic Genealogy and Practice by Blaine Bettinger and the late, great Debbie Parker Wayne, who unfortunately passed away recently. She's taken from the field much too soon, but she's also a big name in the genetic genealogy field, and some other really great books and articles. So I would highly recommend starting there.
Right, thank you. We have another question. Will the recording of the presentation be posted? And that answer is yes, it will be posted to St. Louis County Library's YouTube. That will probably take place within the next couple of weeks, but there's a backlog, so we have no definitive answer on that. But it will be eventually, yes, with the handout attached. Right, do we have any other questions? The link for the handout, it will go out tomorrow morning if you registered for this, which this is how you probably attended this session. It will be included in the registration, the post-registration handout. So you'll get that tomorrow morning about 8 a.m.
And I guess I can also say, if anybody has any additional questions that maybe weren't addressed in the presentation or the handout, if you type my name and then Wustl, W-U-S-T-L, that will bring up my my little profile page on WashU's website, and you can find my email address and contact information there. Happy to chat with you via email as well.
I'm glad you said that, because that was also a question. Perfect. So let's see, I'm checking the watch here. It is about to turn 8. We're going to go ahead and conclude this presentation. And once again, Josiah, we want to thank you so much for giving us all this great information and sharing this with our patrons. And we hope to do this sometime again. And one ironic thing that I find is that we were talking about Darwin, and Darwin's cousin was the pioneer of fingerprinting. So
there you go.
just like runs in the family. So thank you so much for taking the time to give us all this wonderful information. And Everybody who's watching this, make sure you check out slcl.org for more events related to genealogy and all sorts of fun programming. And of course, you could come into our department for any help with your genealogy or local history needs. Thank you very much and have a great night, everybody.